Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Video Access Models, Opportunities, and Risks, which is sponsored by Alexander Street, a ProQuest company. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you should be able to follow along with the presentation materials. Along the right-hand side, you should see a Q&A panel and perhaps a chat panel. If you don't see the chat panel, you can access that by clicking the little button that looks like a dialog cloud on the bottom of your screen. And if you don't see the chat panel, you can click the three little dots, and that will open up more options where you can find the chat panel, or the Q&A panel. Sorry about that. Please use the Q&A panel to submit questions for our speaker, David Parker, today throughout the presentation. We'll take some time at the end to get to as many as we have time for, so please do feel free to send in your questions throughout. You can use the chat panel to message me directly about any troubleshooting issues that you may have, and there we will deal with that issue privately, so please take advantage of that. Today, we're using the hashtag ACRLChoiceWebinars during the event. So if you have another screen handy, shout out to us. We're at choice_reviews on Twitter. Also note that we are recording today's program, and everyone that registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the recorded presentation. All right. And with that, we are ready to get started. So I will turn it over to you, David.
Mark. So this is David Parker, and I am coming to you from the Admirals Club in the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. I made the grave mistake of miscalculating my flight on my way to Kansas City for the National Media Market Meetings, which is a gathering of aggregators, publishers, and media librarians. A quick bit on my background. I am, as the slide notes, the Senior Director of Product Management for ProQuest. I was with Alexander Street at the point of acquisition by ProQuest. In my role at Alexander Street, I oversaw all of product development. When we were acquired by ProQuest, I was specifically put in charge of running video products for ProQuest. Prior to my time with Alexander Street and ProQuest, I was in the ebook world. I founded a specialty ebook publisher for business education, MBA executive education, called Business Expert Press. And prior to that, I was editor-in-chief for Pearson Education in the business publishing division. A quick note before we get started. I've done this presentation 4 or 5 times, and there are, it's never failed to evoke some degree of controversy around interpretation of some of the data I present. And I want to submit at the outset that I think that's a good thing. I'm going to give you some opinions I have about why the data, why some of the data has produced, that we show has produced some of the changes in cost per use in video acquisition models. It by no means is gospel. It's my opinion. It's open to interpretation and counter arguments, and I welcome those. But I'd like to begin with a question that I ask every time I do this presentation, which is, when do you think YouTube launched? And I'll pause for a moment to let you pop some answers in before I move on and answer the question. Are you seeing some results, Mark? So the poll is complete. Mark, did you get a overwhelming majority in any one answer? So I'm not hearing from Mark, so I'm going to go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Here, let me share those poll results. When I close a
Thanks.
poll, it prevents me from speaking. So,
Okay, well, no answer won, but of the folks that answered, the majority were on B, February 14th, 2005, which is correct. That is absolutely right. The reason that I start with that is because Alexander Street launched our first streaming video database at the very beginning of 2006. So we were not very far behind the launch of YouTube, which I think is indicative of a long history that we have in streaming video distribution, and we draw daily in thinking about how we continue to offer options to libraries for acquisition of video. Our first streaming database was theater and video, and our product development model that we used in developing that product and subsequent products was very much oriented around focusing on a specific discipline. We would then develop a bibliography of video titles that we would go out and license and then curate around a topical theme like theater and video. Once we had the critical mass of content that we felt was necessary for launch, we would launch that collection and present it to library purchasers via our sales force. There was relatively little involvement with librarians in this process, except in the very early product discovery phase, where we try to ascertain which course areas lent themselves best to video being a good support for teaching and research. Most of those sales for the ensuing decade, from 2006 onward, were in the form of perpetual access license collections with some subset of subscription sales and almost no single title sales. Excuse me. So fast forward to 2014, and the scenario had changed dramatically in just 8 short years. By 2014, various access options were really dominating, and the library purchaser and their buying process was at the front end of the video acquisition process. So the library purchaser, the media librarian, the electronic resource librarian is fielding all sorts of inputs, faculty requests. They have subject-specific librarians reviewing content and making decisions about films that might be worth adding to the collection. And in their decision about how to acquire, they're balancing term of access against cost of access. And then the assessment of those access options is being balanced against the library's larger collection development strategy. Maybe the library favors perpetual access, maybe it doesn't. These are all filtered through the library decision makers matrix based on these requests they're getting for video, and then ultimately the library is making a decision about how to acquire single title sales, DVDs, sometimes Blu-rays for classic films are still purchased, demand-driven acquisition, aggregation products, so large multidisciplinary subscription-only products that grow and grow and grow over time. And of course, still specialty collections like the aforementioned theater and video collection, either publisher-based, topically based, discipline-based. Those are still available and out there and introduced all the time. So we went from a context where at Alexander Street, we were offering basically one product model, the curated collection sold primarily as PAL, to where we were giving libraries the options and opportunities to acquire as they saw fit based on all of these different inputs that were being balanced. So how does that look in real time today at Alexander Street? And as far as this presentation goes, this is about as salesy a slide as you're going to get from me for just for what it's worth. But I wanted to give you a real context and example of what it means to think about options or access options. So on my left, your left, you see the Alexander Street store. This is a way for libraries to acquire single titles through either DVD or single title streaming, 1 year, 3-year subscription, or perpetual access license. We also, of course, offer demand-driven acquisition, and we'll say more about that later. Academic Video Online is our large multidisciplinary subscription product. And then you see the BBC Landmark Video Collection on the far right, which is just an example of the kind of curated collection that we still offer. The key point, though, is that we understand from working with our library patrons over, a 14-year period that different practices and different policies are going to come from every library's collection development strategy and budget profile about how they want to acquire video. And we're best positioned as a provider to give you choice. I like to say that we offer 100% of the access options, although there are always new options emerging that we need to stay on top of. But 100% of the access options for available to 100% of your budget as a library. So I'm going to focus for the rest of the presentation on looking at how the access model of demand-driven has changed the landscape and how our understanding of demand-driven and subscription access has changed our understanding of the landscape of acquisition. I say kind of jokingly, a funny thing happened on the way to video DDA. Recall that I mentioned that prior to coming to Alexander Street, I was running a business ebook publisher, so I was quite steeped in the world of demand-driven access. And it's no surprise that at the time that that video became widely available and demand-driven around 2013, there were a lot of triggers at work in the market that suggested that it was going to be a very affordable, effective model for acquiring video. And I give a couple of slides here as examples of why, based on what was going on in the larger environment of acquisition, and particularly around ebooks, as to why the libraries would think that video DDA acquisition would be more cost effective. You can see this study that ProQuest ran, ended in the summer of 2018, where the cost per use was $3.34 with our demand-driven platform versus firm ordering at $5.61. And of course, you could see the difference in the number of uses per title as well. So it was very clearly a well-established fact that cost per use with ebooks was much better with demand-driven. Of course, at the time and today, and perhaps almost constantly, we're dealing with these various crises around access, budget, low circulation, all kinds of phenomena out there in the market. I drew this slide from a Carly presentation I sat in 2014, and you see that the librarians presented said all of these factors equal a lot of interest in PDA solutions, be it video or ebook. So this phenomena was fueled by some reliable studies done by libraries, and this is a good example of a presentation I sat in late 2013, where Amherst, Simmons, Latrobe, and QUT, along with Canopy, demonstrated pretty unequivocally that the cost per use with DDA for video was much better than the circulation or cost per use libraries were getting with DVDs and with those purchased collections. Remember the ones I was describing that Alexander Street began with back in 2006. Quite clearly, the early indicators of DDA in video were that it was going to be a more cost-effective access model for libraries. And so everybody rolled, not everybody, but many schools, many folks rolled aggressively towards DDA. we saw huge growth in our DDA signups and enrollments from about 2016 on or 2015 on. And our competitors, of course, saw the same thing as well. So in 2017, we all got together and put some data on our cost per use Canopy, Films on Demand, and Alexander Street for a presentation we did at Charleston. So by now we're 3 solid years into demand-driven access for video, and a lot of data is being aggregated and developed. And we worked with a couple of librarians from 2 different state institutions to aggregate a lot of cost per use data across a number of different school types: large, small, private, nonprofit, public, and then also took snapshots of cost per use across different platforms. And it was really telling that we were starting to see by 2017, for reasons related to primarily massively increasing usage of video, the cost per use across different access models was starting to coalesce. You see in the case of Films on Demand, their average across a 20-school sample was as low as $1.37. The Canopy sample across 20 was $3.42. The example we pulled from Alexander Street's usage, and this was a combination cost per use look by combination of subscription and DDA, demand-driven access, that we saw cost per use as low as 61 cents and as high as $5.10. So in effect, you're seeing a range between subscription and demand-driven access of between 61 cents in one case and $5.10 in another case. So the band, if you will, of cost per use range or volatility was really beginning to compress. Go to the next slide. So we went back in 2018, a year after the Charleston presentation, and sampled a couple of the participants to see how their cost per use had changed. And in this slide, this is a large public university that participated in the original survey. This is a combination of their total spend, demand-driven access and subscription. You can see that in 2017, the majority of their spend was going towards subscription, and their cost per use there was $3.63, and their demand-driven access spend, or pardon me, cost per use was $2.73. In 2018, you see that massively shifted, and that although although their cost per use and subscription went down dramatically, their total spend their total aggregate spend increased rather massively on demand-driven access. So it was really a shocker, and we went out to a few more participants in the study to ask them the same question and see what it would tell us, what it would yield. So another school gave us a little more data. This is a large private university from the Northeast. They shared with us their cost per use, total spend, and number of plays. And you can see again in 2017 that their, and by the way, pardon me, let me back up. This was isolating just their demand-driven. So we were not looking at their subscription spend. The school was only using demand-driven access example. So their total cost was something slightly over $40,000 in 2017, with a cost per use of about $3.99. Fast forward to the end of 2018, and you see a massive increase in their total spend, while their cost per use didn't quite double, and their plays darn near double. So I put a little line in there that says marketing, arrow in there that says marketing efficacy. And this is a point I make, an interpretation I make of the data that, again, has triggered a lot of conversation around and a lot of opinions around around why cost, total spend would go up so dramatically and cost per use would not increase at the same rate. And my main argument for that is about marketing efficacy. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But what I mean by that is around the middle to late 2017, you started seeing all of the video distribution platforms focus much more aggressively on social media marketing, both to faculty and to end user patrons. And my contention is that our use of that tactic has been particularly effective in driving views of particular titles rather than randomized views across a total catalog that come through searching and discovery of the library's assets. So in other words, if I put specific titles in front of patrons over and over again with compelling messages, and they click on it quickly, accumulating the views required to trigger a title, I'm going to drive up the total spend of a particular account much faster than their cost per use would go up, because the usage isn't randomized across all the titles in the platform. So another example of that, sorry, I hit the wrong button again, is here from a smaller school, a private university, students. And here again, you see similarly that the total spend went up much more dramatically from 17 to 18 than the cost per use went up. Use went up only slightly more. So again, this is very effective targeting, in my view, of content marketing at end user patrons, contributing to more quickly triggering titles and generating sales of those titles. My point is that targeted social media campaigns aimed at students and faculty patrons will inevitably generate a fourth view more often and more expeditiously than randomized viewing across the platform. So let me give you some examples of the type of social media marketing, social media describing. Let me make clear that everyone's doing this. This is a common practice that all of the players in the space are using. Here's some examples of faculty social media marketing. Notice that there's an emphasis on describing the scenario that the video addresses, how it can be used in a classroom context. Here's a reference to the global library database, global issues library database, and how a film about film on deportation of families impacts the family and the children in particular. Videos that are focused on newsworthy events, science in the classroom. These are designed and driven towards faculty in the hopes that they will select them and add them to their course, embed them via LTI or learning tools interoperability into their learning management systems to make them easy access for students to watch. These are examples of video or social media posts that are really more focused on students and patrons and users for the purpose of enjoying video for entertainment, emphasis on free viewing, fun feature films, fun documentaries, things that people find entertaining and fun to watch, right? So that's a different way of marketing content, different way of aiming it at patrons, end users versus faculty. And in the end, both methods drive usage, drive triggers, drive engagement with film. And in the end, that really is our goal, regardless of which video distribution platform you're talking to or about. We are in the game to put great content in front of librarians and your patrons for both entertainment and for education, depending on the perspective of the library and what their goals are for their collections and for their patrons' needs. So this last summer, I worked with Maverick and Against the Grain wholesome survey data across sampling of libraries. I write a column for Against the Grain called Blurring Lines. In the column, I look at people, places, or institutions and businesses that are blurring the lines in ways that we wouldn't expect between distribution models, content types, genres that might point towards future new products, new business models, new ways of conducting librarianship. So the data was collected in the context of developing one of those columns for Against the Grain. And we had 56 responses from the survey, and not surprisingly, you see that 40% of the respondents expected that their DDA spend was going to increase in this academic year. 33% expected an increase in their subscription spend. So you all are telling us that you're going to be spending more money on video. Not surprising, right? The one that really jumped out at me and surprised me was that we saw this 37% expected increase in mediated access spend. Well, mediated access spend to video was pretty much for us at Alexander Street virtually non-existent in 2017-18. And here we saw it emerging on our platform, but also in conversations we watch out in the news about various library acquisition strategies. And it really showed through in this data that nearly, again, 37% of respondents expected that they were going to dramatically or expected to increase their mediated spending. And mediated spending, of course, is a loaded phrase, because I say loaded because it comes with expectations about time investments that I'm sure you're all, if I could see you, people would be nodding their heads. The amount of work that's involved with fielding these requests from patrons, both faculty and students, about video titles that they've discovered on the platform that they want to watch, and then the library has to decide, do we turn that on, do we pay for that, do we acquire it through some means, can be very time consuming. So mediated access is not a simple way to acquire video. So I'm going to finish up with some key learnings and some considerations before we turn to the Q&A that have come in our work with these data sets and with these libraries, and thinking about what the spend and cost per use data tells us. First, I think, is that the 2014 assumption that was widely shared across libraries and vendors such as Alexander Street, that DDA would be a more cost-effective method of acquiring video books based on libraries' experience with ebook acquisition, simply has turned out to be wrong. The dimensions or the dynamics that drive video acquisition, video use, are rather different. And we could have a whole conversation about why we think that is. But the bottom line is videos get used in different ways, in different numbers, and in different volumes than books do. And it contributes to a different profile for spend in demand-driven access for video. But there's a big exception to that, and it really shows through in our data, which is when a school is focusing on a particular discipline or a particular publisher to profile or limit the titles exposed in demand-driven access, the cost per use becomes exceptionally good. So, for example, we're a major provider of nursing video on our platform, and those schools that have profiled or limited their demand-driven content to just nursing content have seen really, really exceptional cost per use. The third point, which I made in the prior slide, that is that mediated video purchasing is exploding with all the attendant implications that has for budgets, staff budget, time consumption, et cetera, et cetera. The fourth point, we all want usage. Vendors believe that if we're providing real value to you in our platforms and our content and our analytics and our buying models, Mark, your box jumped right in front of my slide. There we go, I got it out of the way. That we believe that if our content and our platforms and our analytics support isn't resulting in great usage of the content, that we're not doing our job as a vendor. So we all want usage. We want to see content assigned for courses, potentially student self-study, for entertainment, but we all have to decide what kind of usage we want. And when I say we all, I mean in particular you as librarians in defining your acquisition and collection development strategies. What do you want to provide for, what are your end goals in terms of providing great content that generates exceptional usage? Final point, that video usage is growing rapidly. At the end of the day, the numbers I showed you from these different schools and these broader data sets about cost per use change, the number one driver is inevitably just massively increasing usage of the asset video. And of course, we believe the primary driver of that is that faculty are using these videos in their course design, both for hybrid courses, for online courses, and in-person, face-to-face courses. The demand just continues to grow and grow. But we also are seeing that students are using the platforms as alternatives to consumer products, to being on limited budgets, trying to use the library as a resource, perhaps as an alternative to subscribing to multiple consumer video platforms. We've seen that growing as a phenomenon too. Anyway, that's the presentation. I'm thankful that I had the opportunity to do this today. It's always a little different to do it online without direct interaction. So I'm hoping it was valuable, hoping it was useful. I'm available for follow-up questions. And Mark, I'll turn it to you now for the Q&A.
All right. So we do have a few questions already in the hopper, but I would say to attendees out there, if you have additional questions for David, please feel free to drop those into the Q&A now. And we've got plenty of time to answer questions, so we'll get to, I'm sure, quite a few of them. All right, so looking through the queue here, we have a question from Michael who asks, David, could you please address the differences between DDA and PDA? Is there a difference? Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I'm apologetic that I didn't define terms at the outset. Forgive me. One of the perils of having done this presentation so many times. There is no difference. The terms are used all interchangeably. Patron-driven acquisition, or PDA, versus demand-driven acquisition, or DDA. There really is no difference.
Okay, great. And I think you were talking about this a bit earlier in the presentation, and maybe this has since become clear, but I will give you an opportunity to respond to Charlie's question here. And Charlie asks, how does Alexander Street market streaming video directly to the end users? I think you talked a bit about doing so through social media. Are there other ways that Alexander Street sort of directly targets the end users?
Yeah, great question, Charlie. So we use a combination of email marketing and social media posting. So on any given day or any given week, we are, I hate the word targeting, but we're targeting different faculty segments, so by discipline typically, and selecting content that we believe is a really great fit for the curriculum that faculty is teaching, and then developing messaging around that title that helps them think through how they would incorporate it into their syllabus. So we're doing that through, as I say, email campaigns to our database of emails where faculty have opted in. I think that's a key point. We don't spam people. They opt in to receive our messaging. And then also through social media, which is a combination of regular posts, meaning we just post on our accounts. So those that have followed us on Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter are going to see titles in our feed. And then the other version of that is paid social, where we pay for a placement and it appears in everyone's feed whom we've identified as people that we think we'd want to receive that. So, for example, people that have a faculty designation in their profile, or people that have associated with a university, anything that we believe would indicate they are a faculty member. I will say that our focus is pretty exclusively on aiming these at faculty in the context of aligning the video to a particular discipline with a particular syllabus-driven context.
Okay, great. We have another question here from Brenda, who asks, and also sort of comments. Brenda says, our college won't allow us to have an open purchase order for videos. This has stopped us from buying on demand. Is there a way available to cap the spending or to limit it by time for that demand-driven acquisition model?
Yeah, we don't have a time limiter on demand-driven access, but we do have spending cap limiters, and those can be as low as $2,000. And we send out notifications as soon as you get to as soon as you surpass half of the spend, we start notifying you, so you have ample warning about where you are against your cap, so you can make decisions about turning it off, or increasing your allocation of the cap. But no, we don't have time limiters on the access to demand-driven. You have to make the decision to turn it off.
Okay, great. And looking through the questions here, we've got a question here from Robert, who asks, how are libraries with DDA reacting to direct marketing to faculty and students? Have you spoken with, I'm sure you've spoken with librarians, but have you gotten reactions to the marketing that's going out to the faculty?
Well, great question. So that gets back to my comment at the outset that this topic has generated some controversy. As I mentioned, first off, the direct marketing or email marketing in particular that goes to faculty is based on faculty opt-ins. So I very, very frequently attend faculty-facing conferences and speak to faculty who very much appreciate the fact that we are trying to curate or select titles that fit their course curricula, that they can quickly preview and decide whether it fits into their syllabus. Of course, I've also talked to faculty that really, really resent it, that they don't want any vendor putting anything in front of them. But I would say they are the exception, and of course they have the ability to opt out. Where I think the controversy around this becomes more significant is when we speak with librarians about it. And librarians have generally very strong feelings about what vendors are doing in terms of communicating with patrons and end users. So our policy has been, to make really clear that, number one, this is only done through opt-in. And number two, we are very careful to make sure that we're focusing on course-aligned content that's discipline-specific and aimed primarily at those use cases where we believe it contributes to a much better fit with the course. And I would also add that what we do see is that in most cases the net effect is For subscription customers, of course, much better cost per use because it's a fixed cost and it's driving it down. In the demand-driven access world, of course, it can have the opposite effect. But again, many or most of our patrons have opted into profiles that fit to specific subsets of content or focus areas of content.
Okay, great. We have several other questions here. And let's take this one here from Ruth, who asks, did all of your research focus on large institutions? Do you feel that the information that came from the surveys and those sorts of things applies broadly across institution sizes?
Hey, so that's an excellent question. I would say that I gave one example in there of a university, a private university with 11,000 or fewer students. But I will say that the original data set, remember when I showed the slide where I presented the sample from Alexander Street, info-based films on demand, and Canopy, and I showed the swing of 61 cents to $5.61. That sample, in particular, the sample from Alexander Street, did not include very many community colleges in it. So we don't, at the time, we didn't have quite the number of community college subscribers that we do today. I will say that, I have to be careful saying this because I don't work for Films on Demand, but I do know distribution across the community college space is stronger than ours from data I've seen, and you'll note that their cost per use was the lowest among all three platforms. So that's a great question, and the answer is that the data sets are a little bit light, particularly on our side on the community college space, but they are represented in the Films on Demand data set. Overall, I think you can extrapolate from the data generally that the cost per use is in line for small to medium to large institutions with the numbers I showed you in that slide. But there's a bit of extrapolating going on there, obviously.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. We have a question here from Michael who asks, and sort of comments as well, cost per use is one metric of value to libraries, but how else does Alexander Street measure the value of streaming media to patrons, or how might a library measure the value of streaming media to patrons?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. We did a lot of work on impact measures 3 or 4 years ago, understanding what is the value. How do you put a value on a video that changes a person's way of seeing or thinking about a particular issue or topic? How do you put a value on a video that gets watched one click, one view, but it's in a classroom with 800 students? So what we did is we developed, and our competitors have developed as well, Canopy, Infobase, others have developed broader engagement and impact measures that you can access as patrons, or as librarians, that give an indication of other measures of value of the video. So for example, with Alexander Street, at the end of each one of our videos, we include a option for the viewer to give the video a rating of 1 to 5 stars, and to also indicate why they watched it through a choice of 4 or 5 different options. So that's a great way for us to interpret, and you as a library to go back to your admin portal and interpret how those videos have been used and why. Now there are other measures, engagement measures on the platform, on the admin portal, that will let you know what time of day movies were watched or videos were watched, how long, what was the total length of the average video that was watched, what kind of device they were watched on, how many of them were watched via learning management system, which I think is a super critical indicator of whether the videos that are being triggered, used, watched on your campus are part of faculty courses versus independent student viewing. But the summary answer to the question is check out your admin portals, regardless of who your vendor is, and see what they're offering in terms of engagement and impact measures.
All right. Good to know, and I'm sure good advice. Let me see what other questions we've got here. So Maureen asks, what are Alexander Street's mechanisms for previewing videos, especially in a DDA model? Can you speak a little bit about previewing?
Yeah, this has always been a hot topic, particularly around DDA, because the DDA trigger as a standard from the various platform providers is 30 seconds. And I've heard, often that 30 seconds before a title triggers really isn't an adequate amount of time to gauge whether the viewer got the value from it they need. And I hear that. I do. I've taken that on board. The only other option that we offer, other than the 30-second preview before it's counted as a trigger, we do offer 24-hour previews of titles to faculty through our platform. So if you have a faculty member who's thinking about a title, that's another way for them to access it, watch it, assess it without it counting as a trigger against your demand-driven title count.
Okay, great. We have a question here from from Eleanor, who asks, could you please explain why the cost per use goes up with greater usage? I know you talked about that a little bit, but could you could you explain the mechanism sort of behind that?
Yeah. So again, by the way, I want to be really clear that this is my interpretation of the data I've seen that has presented itself concomitant with notable increases in title level marketing to patrons and librarians and faculty over the past couple of years. So what I'm saying is that the more you put specific titles in front of patrons that generate enthusiasm and interest and generate the fourth view, which triggers the sale, you accumulate more total spend against fewer aggregate views. So the total spend is going up quicker than the total aggregate views, which generates a higher cost per use. Make sense?
Okay. Yes.
Versus the old days, which I guess is only 4 or 5 years ago, when your viewership on the platform that generated triggers was the result largely of patrons searching the library's discovery layer or the database, the video database, and finding titles of interest and watching them. Right? It was driven much less by targeted campaigns around specific titles and much more about just open discovery of content.
Got it. Yeah. That makes sense. Okay, so we have a question here from Cheryl who asks, if a platform gives libraries the choice between PDA and mediation, and the mediation takes time, and the PDA, as we've been talking about, can drive up costs. Do you have any advice for libraries about what should they do in that situation?
Wow.
Yeah, it's a big.
That's the $1 million question.
It's a tough question. Yeah.
So what I tell people that come to Alexander Street is that, look, you're working with a fixed budget, and probably the right way to do this is to use a combination of access models and acquisition models, right? Decide if you want to use some of your budget towards demand-driven, pick publishers or content sets that you know are high in demand on your campus and really important for curriculum and course development, and limit it to those, and then fill in around that with subscription aggregation products or collections on subscription that have fixed known costs that are within the cap of your budget. That model will rarely, if ever, produce outpaced spending that you couldn't have anticipated.
All right, great. Let's see. So among some of the questions that we still have, so I'm not sure if you can speak to this one necessarily, but I'll throw it out there in case you can. Amanda asks, is user behavior, surfing, for example, being taken into account in the rising costs of DDA? What metrics specifically is being used to extrapolate like the impact of behaviors like surfing? And I think you were talking just a minute ago about, this is sort of your interpretation of the data that you've seen. Does surfing figure into that?
That's a great question, because it sits in between the extrapolation presentation between cause and effect. That is, I say that the effect or the result of higher total spends and higher cost per use on demand-driven access is a result of the cause, a cause, or not the cause, but a cause being targeted marketing of titles at patrons. In between there, one would assume that targeted marketing is producing surfing across platforms and viewing and triggering titles, but I haven't seen studies that have validated or confirmed that. I think it's a worthy topic, and I'm actually making a note that it might be something I want to play around with for my column. I will tell you this: when I was at ALA last year or the year before, I can't remember which one, at the video roundtable, a couple of librarians were showing data about average length of view of videos on their platform that were somewhat startling to me. And the length of the views was on average somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 minutes. And that doesn't suggest to me, now this is, let me make all the caveats in the world here, this is one or two librarians showing data, so you can't extrapolate too broadly, but you couldn't really say that somebody extracted the value of one of our 40-minute documentaries or one of our 20-minute nursing videos by watching it for only 2 minutes, unless that was the precise 2 minutes that a faculty member isolated from the video, clipped, segmented, and embedded in their learning management system. But it's a wonderful question. I don't know the answer to it. I assume it is the case in between the cause and effect that I described in my presentation.
Okay, great. All right, and looking through the questions, I think we've gotten to pretty much all of them. I'll give folks just another second or two to pop one or two more into the Q&A there before we move on. All right, and I'm not seeing too many more questions coming in. Actually, not seeing any more come our way, so I'll assume that we've gotten to the ones that people have. And so I will say thank you to you, David, for taking the time to put together this presentation and to present it, even in some difficult circumstances there. So thank you for your time and the information and the insights. And I would just remind folks out there on the call that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from ACRL and Choice with a link to the recording. And also, you should see a link to our brief 6-question survey in the chat box there. If you could take a minute to fill that out to let us know how we did today and what you thought of the presentation, we would really appreciate it. Thanks again to everybody out there for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the session, and I hope you learned something, and I hope the rest of your day is great. Bye-bye.